At 1 a.m. on September 13, 2025, the Baltic sky over Russia's Primorsk oil port turned into a target zone. Two massive crude carriers, Kustow and Kailun, were tethered to the loading piers, their steel arteries pulsing with voluminous oil bound for Europe and China. Each vessel carried over 120,000 short tons, enough to keep Russia's export lifeline breathing for days. The port's pipelines hummed like veins under pressure, feeding Moscow's war economy through every drop. What no one saw that night was that Ukraine had already marked this place, the country's largest Western export hub, as the point where Russia's economic pulse would be severed. At 1:15 a.m., in a silent field somewhere in northern Ukraine, the first Leot-96 UAV tore into the air. Every 10 seconds after, another followed. Within 7 minutes, 40 drones were gone, an entire strike swarm unleashed into the night. Each drone carried nearly 65 pounds of PBX-12, a dense thermoplastic explosive designed for deep structural penetration. Their target wasn't a military base or radar post, it was Primorsk, the heart of Russia's western energy flow. Instead of flying a direct path, the swarm split into 3 separate axes. 20 took the center corridor through Belgorod-Voronezh, flying low under 650 feet, invisible to most ground radars. 10 swung east, looping through Tambov and Ryazan, slipping past Tula's S-400 and Pantsir S-1 batteries, the defensive wall that protects Moscow's airspace. Another 10 veered west, hugging the Belarus border, using forests and elevation changes to mask from long-range Podsolnuk and Nebo-M radars. Every drone was autonomous, each one navigated using Skynode S, a low-level AI core that stitched together computer vision, infrared feeds, and digital terrain maps in real time. When Russian jammers flooded the air, the system switched automatically to inertial navigation, matching what the onboard cameras saw with preloaded imagery. Forest edges, power lines, transmission towers, every detail became a landmark in its digital memory. By 2 a.m., the swarm was gone from Ukrainian airspace. To Russian radar, it never existed. At 3:41 a.m., Ukraine played a move it had been saving for weeks. From a small control bunker near Kharkiv, operators brought a reconnaissance satellite into manual control. On paper, it was a standard low Earth orbit observer. Practically, it had been refitted with a false reflection module, a compact electronic payload capable of imitating radar returns across multiple frequencies. Its sole job was disruption. For the next 7 minutes, the satellite began transmitting calibrated reflections along the Smolensk-Novgorod radar chain, the same early warning belt that guards Russia's northwest frontier. This was the line that allowed Moscow to see anything incoming from Belarus, Ukraine, or the Baltic. And now it was being blinded. Across command stations in the Leningrad and Novgorod sectors, radar screens lit up with dozens of false signals. Podsolnuk, Gamma DE, and Nebo-M operators suddenly saw a formation of supposed contacts sweeping toward the northwest, each echo strong, each return moving with consistent velocity. To them, it looked like a coordinated air incursion from Belarus. Emergency alerts went up the chain, tracking radars recalibrated. Missile batteries were moved to cover a phantom assault that did not exist. Inside those few chaotic minutes, Russia's northern air defense lost focus on the one thing that mattered, the low-altitude zone beneath their sensors. Down there, under that radar curtain, 40 real Leot-96 UAVs glided forward in total silence. Their digital maps aligned perfectly with the terrain feed. Their onboard AIs compared every tree line, road, and river bend with preloaded imagery to stay on course. Neither did they need external commands, nor satellite guidance. The false radar storm above them bought exactly what Ukraine needed, a clean path straight into Russian airspace. By the time Russian technicians realized the radar interference wasn't natural, the swarm had already crossed the detection belt, 90 minutes from Primorsk, and completely unseen. At 4 a.m., after nearly 3 hours of silent flight, the Leot-96 swarm reached the approaches of the Gulf of Finland, less than 100 miles from Primorsk. The night was still, cloudless, and cold. Every drone maintained a low flight band, hugging the terrain, its composite shells scattering a minimal radar signature. Then, without warning, 5 of them abruptly broke formation. They pulled up hard. Engines roared as they climbed from 300 to over 16,000 feet in less than 40 seconds. Each of these 5 carried a secondary payload, radar reflectors and signal transmitters, emulating the radar profile of a high-altitude strike formation. They were the decoys, the sacrificial layer Ukraine had built into the mission. On Russian radar screens, the trap worked instantly. At 4:08 a.m., operators at the Levo early warning station in Novgorod detected 5 strong, stable returns appearing from the southeast. Speed was moderate, altitude rising, and reflectivity high. The data pointed to reconnaissance aircraft or small strike planes. Within minutes, local air defense went to level 1 alert. 2 Panzer S-1 batteries at Yaroslav locked on, launching 457 E-6 missiles in rapid succession. An S-400 sight fired 248 N-6E interceptors from Cherepovets. 40 seconds later, radar screens cleared. Thermal sensors picked up multiple fragment signatures dropping into the forest north of Novgorod. The command level reached a quick conclusion. 5 intruding targets destroyed. No ongoing threat. However, Russia hadn't shot down an attack. It had eliminated bait. 5 expendable drones, pre-programmed to die, had just drawn out the region's fastest response missiles, each worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, below radar range, the actual strike force moved undisturbed. 35 Leot-96, spaced between 650 and 900 feet apart, continued their approach. They flew below 330 feet, skimming the land contour, each unit syncing through Skynode S's swarm protocol. The AI mapped terrain using live camera feeds and stored 3D data, recalibrating every few seconds. Across Russian radar screens, the illusion of calm returned. Officers marked the incident as contained. However, in actuality, a 35-drone strike group was now inside one of the most heavily defended regions of the Russian Federation, invisible, autonomous, and minutes from the sea. At 4:17 a.m., the main formation crossed Lake Ilmen and entered the corridor between Novgorod and Leningrad, the air defense belt that Russia considered impenetrable. Every radar along that stretch was operational, yet none saw what was coming. The instruments showed silence. However, beneath that calm, 35 autonomous drones were slicing through Russian airspace like a tide moving under ice. The western wing reached the southern rim of the Narva Gulf at 4:22 a.m. There, a faint signal flickered on the Vyborg Air Defense Command screen, an intermittent, low-speed return that barely registered. An officer hesitated. He suggested it might be birds, migrating flocks confused by the coastal light, or an atmospheric glitch. No one wanted to waste a missile on ghosts, so the firing order stalled. At the same time, the eastern formation swept across Lake Onega, tracing the Petrozavodsk-Vyborg rail corridor, one of the arteries that supplied Primorsk. These drones flew with machine precision, constantly matching their onboard feeds with 3D terrain data to counter Russian electronic jamming. Infrared cameras scanned every reflection. The AI compared light patterns, road geometry, and even drainage lines, correcting course in milliseconds. Every tower and antenna along the route was marked. Every radar arc skirted. At 4:27 a.m., the first radar operators near Vyborg finally saw it. Multiple low-speed targets converging from 3 separate directions. Dozens of small echoes were hugging the surface, moving steadily toward the coastline. No one could believe the scope for a moment. The lieutenant colonel on duty hesitated, then ordered Situation Level 2. Expand monitoring sectors and activate nearby Panzer batteries. But the order came too late. By the time the radar sweeps recalibrated, all three attack axes, central, eastern, and western, had already aligned within strike range. This was no scattered raid. It was a coordinated encirclement. Each formation had timed its approach to converge on Primorsk from different directions, within seconds of one another. At 4:28 a.m., the Baltic Air Defense Command confirmed that the swarm was heading straight for the Primorsk oil terminal. 6 Panzer S-1 batteries were ordered to open fire. Missile tubes hissed from the coastal tree line, streaking white trails across the night sky. Ground guns' 30mm autocannons flashed in rhythmic bursts. The Leot-96s didn't take a second to respond. The swarm split into 3 subgroups, weaving through the industrial maze, staying below 200 feet. Every unit was self-governed, but networked, sharing flight data through Skynode S's internal mesh. When one drone banked, others mirrored its motion. For the next 90 seconds, noise ruled the sky. 25 drones were destroyed, some torn apart by flak. Others hit midair by 57 E-6 missiles. However, 10 remained, the Alpha Wolves. Those were heavier, faster, and programmed for final assault. Each carried a unique target and its own algorithm for approach. They were the killing edge of the operation, and Primorsk had less than 5 minutes before they arrived. At 4:44 a.m., the first blast tore through the quiet. The sound rolled, thick and heavy, across the Baltic water. Moments later, flames rose from the port's control building. Inside, screens went black. The staff on night duty barely had time to understand what had happened. 2 drones had hit within seconds of each other, one straight through the operations room window, the other into the backup power block. The lights died, and communications dropped. Primorsk's control center was gone before anyone could reach the fire alarms. Down at Pier South, Kustow was still connected to the fueling grid. The ground trembled when the first drone hit the tanker's engine room. A second slammed into the main transfer line. The pressure burst threw men off their feet. Raw oil flooded the deck, spilling into the water. When it caught fire, it moved like liquid glass. People ran, tripping over pipes, shouting names that disappeared under the noise. At 4:45 a.m., Kailund was next. One drone hit the intake control room, and another drove into the bridge. The blast hurled steel plates into the air. A column of fire shot upward, orange and blinding against the night sky. The heat was so strong that the closest workers couldn't breathe. Some jumped into the water to survive. 3 more drones reached the pumping yard. They came in low, almost skimming the ground. One hit the compressor array, another the pressure regulator, and the third the control receiver. The pipes shook under the sudden surge. A few seconds later, everything blew. A shockwave tore through the yard, lifting parts of the roof clean off. Within minutes, the port had become an open furnace. The heat exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hoses melted before the water even touched the flames. From the air, it looked like a line of fire over a mile long, split into 2 cores and smaller blazes eating through the docks. The export lines were dead, the tankers destroyed, and Russia's western artery cut open. For the first time, its strongest port had fallen quiet under a strike it never expected. Russia's defense ministry claimed most drones were shot down, but everyone had seen the fire from satellites. Traders watched prices flicker, while analysts called it a turning point. Ukraine had spent under a few $1 million. Russia lost a port worth billions, and the illusion that its western front was untouchable. Leave a comment on what you think Russia's next countermeasure could be. And hit subscribe, because the next front might already be forming while you watch this.